The blistering August sun hung low over San Angelo, Texas, in 1875, when Hannah Griffith stumbled from the stage-coach, one hand clutching her swollen belly, and the other gripping a worn leather valise containing everything she owned in the world. Dust clung to the hem of her faded blue dress as she stood in the middle of the busy thoroughfare, a golden band glinting on her finger, a cruel reminder of promises broken. "End of the line, madam," the stagecoach driver called, already tossing down her second bag. It landed with a thud in the dirt, sending up a small cloud of dust. Hannah looked up and down the main street of San Angelo, taking in the saloons, general stores, and hotels that lined both sides. After 3 days of hard travel, she was exhausted, hungry, and desperately in need of a proper bed. The baby kicked, as if sensing her moment of uncertainty, and she placed a protective hand over her 7-month belly. "Is there a decent place to stay in this town?" she asked the driver, who was already occupied with unhitching the horses. "Got 3 hotels," he replied without looking up. "The San Angelo Inn's the nicest. The Western's cheaper. Frontier Lodge is cheapest, but I wouldn't recommend it for a lady in your condition." His eyes flicked briefly to her belly before returning to his work. "Thank you," Hannah said, gathering her courage along with her bags. The San Angelo Inn would be her first stop. With the money she had carefully saved, she could afford a week's stay, enough time to figure out her next move. San Angelo bustled with activity as cowboys, merchants, and townsfolk went about their business. Several men tipped their hats as they passed her, but their polite gestures quickly transformed into raised eyebrows and sidelong glances when they noticed her condition and lack of a companion. Hannah kept her chin high despite their scrutiny. She had endured worse in Philadelphia after Henry abandoned her at the altar, leaving her to face the scandal of being pregnant and unwed. The San Angelo Inn stood proudly at the corner of Concho Avenue, its freshly painted sign and clean windows promising respite. Hannah took a deep breath, adjusted her bags, and pushed through the front door into the cool lobby. A thin man with spectacles perched on his nose looked up from behind the front desk. His welcoming smile faltered as his gaze traveled from her face to her rounded middle. "Good afternoon," Hannah said, setting down her heavy bag. "I'd like a room, please, for a week to start." The clerk cleared his throat, glancing nervously toward a door marked manager before addressing her. I'm afraid that won't be possible, madam. Pardon me. We're fully booked." He avoided her eyes. Hannah looked around at the empty lobby, then at the row of keys hanging on the wall behind him. "It doesn't appear that way, sir." "Well, we have reservations coming in. Important guests from Austin." His fingers fidgeted with a pencil on the desk. "Perhaps the Western Hotel might accommodate you." Hannah recognized the lie for what it was but knew better than to argue. She had faced similar rejection in the last town. With a polite nod, she gathered her bags and stepped back into the heat. The Western Hotel proved no more welcoming. The proprietor, a stout woman with tightly pinned gray hair, didn't even attempt subtlety. "We don't rent rooms to women in your situation," she said, lips pursed in disapproval. "This is a respectable establishment." "I'm a widow," Hannah lied, the words bitter on her tongue. "My husband died in a mining accident." The woman's eyes dropped to Hannah's hand where her wedding ring sat. "Then where's your black armband? Your mourning clothes?" She shook her head. "I wasn't born yesterday, young lady." "Try the Frontier Lodge if you must, but I'd suggest you move along to the next town." By the time Hannah reached the Frontier Lodge, a dilapidated 2-story building with peeling paint and unwashed windows, the sun was setting, and her feet ached something fierce. Even here, at what was clearly the lowest establishment in town, the gruff man at the desk looked her over and shook his head before she could speak. Don't even bother asking, lady. Boss don't allow your type. My type? Hannah's patience had worn thin. I'm simply a woman in need of a room for the night. A woman in your condition without a husband, he spat into a brass spittoon. You're looking for charity and we ain't giving it. Hannah fought back tears of frustration. I have money to pay. Don't matter. Find somewhere else. Back on the street, with darkness falling and nowhere to go, Hannah felt the first stirrings of real fear. She had money, but no place to spend it. She had traveled hundreds of miles to escape judgment, only to find it waiting for her in Texas too. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, a reminder of her responsibility. She made her way toward a small restaurant, thinking she might at least get a meal and inquire about a room to rent, when two cowboys emerged from the saloon across the street, laughing loudly. One noticed her and nudged his companion. They changed direction, heading toward her with the loose-limbed swagger of men who'd been drinking. "Well, look what we got here, Roy," said the taller of the two, blocking her path. "Pretty little lady all alone at night." Hannah clutched her bags tighter and tried to step around them. "Excuse me, gentlemen." The second man, Roy, moved to block her again. "Now don't be unfriendly. We're just being neighborly." His eyes lingered on her belly. "Looks like you've been plenty friendly with somebody before." "Please let me pass," Hannah said, her voice firmer than she felt. "Maybe we could help you out," the tall one suggested. "Girl like you needs protection in a town like this." Hannah's heart pounded. She was tired, vulnerable, and running out of options, but she knew better than to accept help from men like these. "She's already got protection." The deep voice came from behind the cowboys. They turned, revealing a tall man standing in the street. The dying sunlight silhouetted him, casting his face in shadow, but Hannah could make out broad shoulders, a straight-brimmed hat, and the unmistakable outline of a holstered gun at his hip. "Mind your business, Steele," the taller cowboy muttered. "The lady is my business," the man Steele said calmly. "Now step aside." Something in his tone made both cowboys reconsider their position. They glanced at each other, then back at him. "Didn't know she was spoken for," Roy said, backing away. "No offense meant." "None taken," Steele replied, his voice level but carrying an undertone that made it clear the conversation was over. The cowboys retreated across the street, occasionally glancing back. Only when they disappeared into the saloon did Hannah's rescuer approach her. As he stepped into the light spilling from a nearby window, she could finally see him clearly. He wasn't as young as she'd first thought, perhaps in his early 30s, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the Texas sun. His eyes were a startling blue beneath the brim of his hat, and a neatly trimmed beard covered his jaw. He wore simple, practical clothes, a blue cotton shirt, worn leather vest, and denim pants tucked into scuffed boots. "Are you all right, madam?" he asked. Hannah nodded, still clutching her bags. "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Steele." "Heath Steele," he corrected, touching the brim of his hat. "And you are?" "Hannah Griffith," she replied, then added, "Mrs. Griffith," though the title felt like a lie on her tongue. Heath's eyes briefly flicked to her belly, then back to her face without judgment. "I couldn't help noticing you've been to every hotel in town." Hannah flushed with embarrassment. "You've been watching me. San Angelo isn't that big, and a new face gets noticed." He gestured to her bags. "I take it you're having trouble finding accommodations." "They won't rent to me," she admitted, too tired for pretense. "Apparently, I'm not the sort of guest they welcome." Heath nodded, seeming to understand the situation perfectly. "This town can be particular about appearances." He paused, considering something. "I have a place outside town. It's not fancy, but there's a spare room that's clean and private. You can stay with me until you sort things out." Hannah stared at him, taken aback by the offer. Every instinct told her to refuse. She didn't know this man. He might be worse than the cowboys he'd scared off. But she was exhausted, the baby was making her back ache something fierce, and night was falling in a town that had already made it clear she wasn't welcome. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "You don't know me." "My mother taught me never to leave someone in need when I could offer help," he said simply. "Especially not a lady expecting." There was something in his direct gaze that inspired trust, despite her caution. "I can pay," she offered. Heath shook his head. "That's not necessary. It's just a spare room that's sitting empty anyway." He gestured to her bags. "May I?" After a moment's hesitation, Hannah nodded. Heath picked up her heaviest bag with ease. "My wagon's this way," he said, nodding down the street. "It's about a 30-minute ride to my place." As they walked, Hannah cast one last glance at the town that had rejected her. "Will your wife mind the intrusion?" she asked, watching his reaction carefully. "No wife," Heath replied. "No family at all, just me and about 40 head of cattle." He gave her a reassuring smile. "But like I said, the room is private. You'll be safe." Against all better judgment, Hannah believed him. Perhaps it was desperation, or perhaps it was something in those steady blue eyes. But she found herself climbing into his wagon a few minutes later, heading away from the lights of San Angelo and into the darkness of the Texas night. Heath's property lay just over 3 miles outside of town, close enough for convenience, but far enough to offer privacy and space. As they approached, moonlight revealed a modest but well-maintained ranch house with a wide front porch. A large barn stood to one side, and in the distance, Hannah could make out corrals and grazing land stretching toward the horizon. "It's not much," Heath said as he helped her down from the wagon, "but it's home." "It's lovely," Hannah replied, and meant it. After 3 days of travel and hours of rejection, the sight of the solid house with warm light spilling from its windows felt like salvation. Inside, the main room combined a kitchen and living area, with simple but sturdy furniture arranged around a stone fireplace. Everything was remarkably clean and orderly for a bachelor's home, Hannah noticed. A bookshelf held an impressive collection of volumes and a guitar rested in the corner. "The spare room is this way," Heath said, carrying her bags down a short hallway. He pushed open a door to reveal a small but comfortable bedroom with a neatly made bed, a chest of drawers, and a window overlooking the eastern plains. "Bathrooms at the end of the hall. There's a pump for fresh water in the kitchen." Hannah stepped into the room, overwhelmed by the simple kindness after such a difficult day. "Thank you, Mr. Steele. I'm truly grateful." "Heath," he corrected gently. "And you're welcome to stay as long as you need." He set down her bags and stepped back into the hallway. "You must be hungry." "I was about to fix some supper when I went into town. Nothing fancy, but there's plenty." "I wouldn't want to impose," Hannah began. "No imposition," Heath interrupted. "I always cook too much anyway." He gave her a small smile. "Take your time getting settled. Join me when you're ready." When he left, Hannah sat heavily on the edge of the bed, finally letting her guard down. The mattress was firm but comfortable, and the room smelled of fresh air and clean linens. She placed a hand on her rounded belly, feeling the baby shift beneath her palm. "We're safe for tonight at least, little one," she whispered. After washing her face and hands in the bathroom, which was surprisingly modern with a proper indoor pump, and basin, Hannah changed into a clean blouse and smoothed her hair. The woman in the small mirror looked tired but relieved. She took a deep breath and went to join her host. Heath was at the stove, stirring something that smelled deliciously of tomatoes and spices. A pot of coffee bubbled nearby, and the small table was already set for 2. "I hope you like chili," he said without turning. "It's one of the few things I can cook well. It smells wonderful." Hannah hesitated, then asked, "May I help with anything? You could slice that bread if you'd like." He nodded toward a fresh loaf on the counter. "There's butter in the icebox." They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes. Hannah found the domestic activity soothing after the stress of the day. Soon they were seated across from each other, steaming bowls of chili before them. "This is delicious," Hannah said after her first bite, surprised by the complex flavors. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My mother," Heath answered. "She insisted I learn to feed myself properly before she passed." He broke off a piece of bread. "What brings you to San Angelo, Mrs. Griffith? Not many women travel alone, especially in your condition." Hannah considered how much to share. This man had shown her kindness, but her story wasn't one she was proud of. "I'm heading to El Paso," she finally said. "I have a cousin there who's offered me a place to stay until after." She gestured to her belly. Heath nodded, not pressing for details. "That's still a fair journey from here." "Yes. I had to stop in San Angelo when the stage-coach line changed. The next coach to El Paso doesn't leave for 5 days." She stared into her bowl. "I thought I'd stay at a hotel until then. I didn't anticipate the difficulty." "People can be quick to judge," Heath observed. "Yes." Hannah looked up at him. "You didn't," he shrugged. "Not my place to judge anyone, even an unwed mother." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Heath's expression didn't change. "Especially not. Life's complicated enough without strangers adding to the burden." He refilled her water glass. "Is your husband waiting in El Paso?" Hannah twisted the wedding band on her finger. "There is no husband," she admitted quietly. "The ring is." A precaution, though not a very effective one, it seems. She expected to see disapproval cross his face, but Heath simply nodded. "A hard road for a woman alone." "Yes." Relief at his continued neutrality loosened her tongue. "I was engaged to be married in Philadelphia. Henry the father decided 3 days before our wedding that he wasn't ready for a wife, let alone a child." The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. "By then, I was already 5 months along and showing. My parents, they weren't understanding," Heath finished when she trailed off. "My father is a deacon in our church. The scandal was too much. He gave me money for a train ticket and told me not to return." Even now, months later, the memory brought a lump to her throat. "I'm sorry," Heath said simply. "That can't have been easy." "The hardest part was realizing how quickly people can turn on you." Hannah absently touched her belly. "One day I was the deacon's respected daughter. The next I was an embarrassment to be hidden away." "People fear what they don't understand," Heath observed. "Or what threatens their idea of how things should be." Hannah studied him across the table. "You're very philosophical for a rancher." That brought a small smile to his face. "I read a lot. Not much else to do during the winter months. I noticed your bookshelf." She gestured toward the living area. "Quite the collection. A man needs to feed his mind as well as his body." He rose to pour coffee for them both. "What did you do in Philadelphia before?" "I was a school teacher," Hannah replied. "I taught children to read and write. I loved it." She accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. "I hope to teach again someday once the baby is older." "El Paso could use good teachers," Heath said. "The town's growing fast." They continued talking as they finished the meal, the conversation flowing easily between them. Hannah learned that Heath had moved to Texas from Missouri after the war, buying this land when it was little more than scrub and building it into a modest but successful cattle operation. He had never married, though not, as he put it, for lack of interest in the institution. He simply hadn't met the right woman, and he wasn't one to settle for less than what his parents had shared, a true partnership based on respect and affection. After dinner, despite Hannah's protests, Heath insisted on washing the dishes while she rested on the sofa. The simple domesticity of the scene, the warm kitchen, the soft lamplight, the quiet conversation soothed her in ways she hadn't expected. For the first time in months, she felt safe. "I should turn in," she said when exhaustion began to overtake her. "It's been a long day," Heath nodded. "Of course, you'll find extra blankets in the chest if you need them. The nights can get cool even in August." "Thank you." Hannah rose carefully, one hand supporting her back. "For everything. Not many would have done what you did today." "Anyone would have," he said, though they both knew it wasn't true. "Sleep well, Mrs. Griffith." "Hannah," she corrected with a small smile. "If I'm to call you Heath, it seems only fair." His answering smile was warm. "Good night then, Hannah." In the small bedroom, with the soft sounds of the ranch settling around her and the knowledge of a decent man just down the hall, Hannah slept better than she had in months. The next morning, Hannah woke to the aroma of coffee and bacon. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous day rushed back: the rejections at the hotels, the encounter with the Cowboys, and Heath Steele's unexpected kindness. She dressed quickly in one of her few remaining clean dresses, a simple blue cotton that strained slightly across her expanding middle. The mirror reflected a woman looking more rested than she had in days, though the dark circles beneath her eyes hadn't completely faded. Heath was at the stove when she entered the kitchen, turning bacon in a cast iron skillet. He glanced up with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Good morning. I hope I didn't wake you." "Not at all," Hannah replied. "I'm usually an early riser. May I help with breakfast?" "You could scramble those eggs if you'd like." He nodded toward a bowl of beaten eggs waiting on the counter. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." They moved around the small kitchen with surprising ease, as if they'd done this dance many times before. Hannah found herself relaxing into the simple domestic task, appreciating the normalcy after months of upheaval. "I need to head into town this morning," Heath said as they sat down to eat. "Need to pick up some supplies. You're welcome to come along if you'd like, or you can stay here and rest." Hannah considered her options. The thought of facing San Angelo again wasn't appealing, but staying alone in a stranger's home, even one as seemingly trustworthy as Heath, felt presumptuous. "I should come with you," she decided. "I need to check on the stagecoach schedule to El Paso, and I could use some supplies myself." Heath nodded. "We'll leave after breakfast then." The ride into town was pleasant in the fresh morning air. Heath's wagon was well sprung, making the journey easier on Hannah's pregnant body than the previous day's stagecoach had been. He pointed out landmarks as they traveled: the creek where the best fishing could be had, the old oak where he sometimes took lunch when working the south pasture, the ridge where wildflowers bloomed spectacularly in spring. "It's beautiful land," Hannah observed. "You've done well with it." "It's good cattle country," Heath agreed. "Not as fertile as some parts of Texas, but reliable if you know how to work it." He glanced at her. "Have you spent much time in the West before?" "None at all," she admitted. "Philadelphia is the farthest west I'd been until this journey." "Everything here is so vast." "Takes some getting used to," Heath nodded. "But there's freedom in that vastness, room to breathe, room to start fresh." The words hung between them, and Hannah wondered if he'd chosen them deliberately, a reminder that new beginnings were possible, even after catastrophic endings. San Angelo was bustling when they arrived, the morning rush of commerce in full swing. Heath helped Hannah down from the wagon with careful hands, and she couldn't help but notice the looks they received, some curious, some disapproving. Being seen with Heath Steele marked her in some way, though whether positively or negatively, she couldn't yet tell. "I need to stop at the mercantile and the feed store," Heath said. "The stagecoach office is just there." He pointed to a small building down the street. "Shall we meet at the cafe for lunch in an hour?" "That would be fine," Hannah agreed, appreciating both his assistance and his understanding that she might want to conduct some business independently. At the stagecoach office, Hannah confirmed what she already knew: the next coach to El Paso wouldn't leave for 4 more days. She purchased her ticket, wincing slightly at the cost but grateful she had enough saved to afford it. The clerk was polite but distant, his eyes occasionally darting to her belly with poorly disguised curiosity. Next, Hannah visited the general store for personal items: soap, hairpins, and a new comb to replace one broken during her journey. The storekeeper's wife watched her with narrowed eyes as she browsed, and Hannah could feel the weight of judgment in the woman's gaze. She selected her items quickly, paid, and left. With time to spare before meeting Heath, Hannah found herself drawn to the small bookstore she'd spotted across the street. Inside, the scent of paper and leather bindings welcomed her. The proprietor, an older gentleman with spectacles perched on his nose, greeted her warmly, the first genuinely friendly face she'd encountered in San Angelo besides Heath's. "Good morning, young lady. Can I help you find something?" "Just browsing, thank you," Hannah replied, relieved at his cordial tone. "Take your time." He gestured to the shelves. "Not often we get customers who appreciate the written word. Most folks around here are too busy wrestling cattle to wrestle with ideas." Hannah smiled at that and turned her attention to the books. Her fingers trailed over spines with titles both familiar and new. She paused at a collection of poetry by Walt Whitman, opening it to read a few lines. "Excellent choice," the shopkeeper commented. "Whitman understands the American spirit better than most." "He's one of my favorites," Hannah admitted. "I taught his poetry to my older students in Philadelphia." "A teacher," the man brightened further. "We could use more of those in San Angelo. The school here is overcrowded with just 2 teachers for nearly 60 children." This caught Hannah's attention. "The school is looking for teachers, always," he nodded emphatically. "Can't keep them. Young women come west, then get married and leave the classroom. Young men find better paying work." He studied her face. "You have the look of a good teacher." Patient eyes. Hannah unconsciously placed a hand on her belly. "I don't think they'd be interested in someone in my situation." The old man's eyes softened with understanding. "Perhaps not immediately. But later, who knows? The school board is desperate enough that they might overlook certain, unconventional circumstances." Hope fluttered briefly in Hannah's chest. Teaching again, doing what she loved, supporting herself and her child was the dream she clung to during her darkest moments. "Something to consider," she said carefully, reluctant to nurture false hope. "Indeed." The shopkeeper nodded toward the book she still held. "Take it as a gift. Every teacher should have poetry close at hand." "Oh, I couldn't, please," he insisted. "Consider it a welcome to San Angelo, however temporary your stay may be." Touched by the unexpected kindness, Hannah accepted the book with heartfelt thanks. Perhaps not everyone in town was as judgmental as she'd feared. When she met Heath at the cafe an hour later, he was already seated at a table near the window. He rose when she approached, pulling out her chair with a courtesy that seemed as natural to him as breathing. "Successful morning?" he asked once they were settled. "Yes," Hannah replied, showing him her ticket and small purchases, including the gifted book. The bookstore owner was very kind. "Old Mr. Peterson, he's a good man. Comes from Boston originally, I believe. Brings a different perspective than most around here." Their conversation was interrupted by the waitress, a young woman who eyed Hannah with open curiosity before taking their orders. When she left, Heath leaned forward slightly. "I ran into Mrs. Winters at the Mercantile. She owns a dress shop on Oak Street and mentioned she's looking for help. Sewing, sales, that sort of thing. His eyes met Hannah's. I took the liberty of suggesting you might be interested in temporary work while you're in town. She seemed amenable to meeting you. Hannah stared at him in surprise. You told her about me. Just that a friend was visiting from back east and might appreciate some employment to pass the time. He shrugged. Mrs. Winters is a widow who raised 3 children on her own. She's less concerned with appearances than most in this town. The thoughtfulness of his action touched Hannah deeply. Temporary work would allow her to preserve more of her savings and give her purpose during the days before her departure. Thank you, she said softly. That was very considerate. Least I could do, Heath replied, his tone making it clear he saw nothing extraordinary in his gesture. Their meal arrived, simple but hearty fare that Hannah realized she was ravenous for. As they ate, Heath told her about his morning errands and his plans for the ranch. He spoke with quiet passion about the cattle he was raising and the improvements he hoped to make to the property. Hannah found herself drawn in by his obvious dedication and the intelligent way he approached his work. You didn't always plan to be a rancher, did you? She asked, sensing something in his manner that spoke of other ambitions. Heath looked surprised at her perception. No, he admitted. I studied law for a time before the war, planned to join my father's practice in St. Louis. What changed? A shadow crossed his face. The war changed everything. My father died while I was fighting. Mother followed a year after I returned. The practice had been sold to cover debts. He shrugged, the gesture not quite as casual as he might have intended. I needed a fresh start. Texas seemed as good a place as any. Hannah understood the need for reinvention all too well. Do you regret it, not pursuing law? Heath considered the question. Sometimes. But there's an honesty to ranching that appeals to me. The work is hard but straightforward. No arguing over technicalities or defending positions you don't believe in. He smiled slightly. And the cattle don't care about my past or my politics. The waitress returned to refill their coffee cups, her eyes darting curiously between them. Hannah was acutely aware of how they must look a visibly pregnant woman and a man who was not her husband, sharing a familiar meal. But Heath seemed unbothered by the scrutiny, continuing their conversation as if they were the only people in the room. After lunch, they visited Mrs. Winters' dress shop. The proprietress was a handsome woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She looked Hannah over with professional assessment rather than judgment. You sew? She asked directly. Yes, madam, Hannah replied. I made most of my own clothes before. She gestured to her expanded waistline. Mrs. Winters nodded. Good. I need someone for alterations and to mind the shop while I work in the back. Can you start tomorrow, 9 to 4 with an hour for lunch, 50 cents a day? The offer was fair, and Hannah accepted gratefully. As they left the shop, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the next 4 days, at least, she would have purpose and income. Thank you again, she said to Heath as they walked back to the wagon. You didn't have to do that. Happy to help, he replied simply. Mrs. Winters needs the assistance as much as you need the work. The rest of the afternoon passed pleasantly as they completed their errands. Heath introduced her to several merchants and townspeople, always referring to her as Mrs. Griffith, a friend from back east. Some received her politely, others with barely concealed suspicion. But Heath's presence seemed to grant her a degree of social protection she wouldn't have had alone. On the ride back to the ranch, Hannah found herself thinking about how quickly her circumstances had changed. Yesterday, she had been alone and unwelcome, facing a night with nowhere to sleep. Today, she had shelter, the prospect of work, and a companion who treated her with unfailing respect. She glanced at Heath's profile as he handled the reins, wondering what twist of fate had placed this decent man in her path just when she needed him most. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, catching her gaze. Hannah smiled. "I was just thinking how differently things might have turned out if you hadn't happened to be in town yesterday." "Fate has its ways," Heath replied, his eyes returning to the road. "My mother used to say that kindness always finds its way back to you. I've found that to be true more often than not." The simple wisdom in his words stayed with Hannah long after they had returned to the ranch. That evening, as they again shared a meal and conversation by lamplight, she began to understand that her rescuer was a man of uncommon depth, a rancher with the soul of a philosopher, and the steady moral compass of someone who had faced darkness and chosen light. For the first time since discovering her pregnancy, Hannah slept without dreams of rejection or abandonment. Instead, she dreamed of open skies and the possibility of beginning again. The next 4 days fell into a surprisingly comfortable rhythm. Hannah rose early each morning, sharing breakfast with Heath before he drove her to town for her work at Mrs. Winter's shop. The dress shop owner proved to be a fair employer with a practical approach to life that Hannah appreciated. Mrs. Winters asked few questions about Hannah's circumstances, focusing instead on her skills and work ethic, both of which met with approval. "You've got a good eye and steady hands," she told Hannah on the second day, examining a particularly delicate alteration Hannah had completed. "Not many have the patience for this kind of detail work." Hannah found satisfaction in the familiar tasks of measuring, cutting, and stitching. The rhythmic work allowed her mind to settle, and the interactions with customers, mostly women who needed dresses altered or advice on fabric choices, gave her a sense of normalcy that had been missing from her life since Philadelphia. Some customers were openly curious about the pregnant newcomer, but Mrs. Winters deftly managed their questions. "Mrs. Griffith is helping me temporarily before continuing to El Paso," she would say, her tone discouraging further inquiry. In the evenings, Heath would collect Hannah from the shop, and they would complete any errands before returning to the ranch. Their conversations during these rides grew increasingly personal and comfortable. Hannah found herself sharing stories of her childhood in Philadelphia, her love of teaching, and even, gradually, her complicated feelings about the baby and its absent father. "I was so angry at first," she confessed one evening as they sat on Heath's porch watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "At Henry, at my parents, at myself. But now—" She placed a hand on her belly, feeling the baby shift. "Now I'm just determined to make a good life for this child, whatever it takes." "That's admirable," Heath said quietly. "Many would have made different choices." Hannah knew he was referring to the women who chose to hide their pregnancies or give their babies away rather than face the social consequences of unwed motherhood. She had considered both options in the dark days after Henry's abandonment. "I couldn't," she said simply. "Whatever circumstances brought this child into being, it deserves love and care. I may not have chosen this path, but I'm committed to walking it as best I can." Heath nodded, his eyes reflecting the sunset's glow. "Your child is fortunate to have such a mother." The genuine respect in his voice touched something deep within Hannah. After months of judgment and condemnation, Heath's acceptance of her choices felt like cool water to a parched spirit. On the third day, while organizing fabric bolts in the shop storeroom, Hannah overheard a conversation between Mrs. Winters and a customer that made her pause. "Staying out at the Steele ranch, I hear," the customer was saying, her voice lowered but still audible. "Quite the scandal brewing." "Margaret Wilson, I expected better from you," Mrs. Winters replied firmly. Heath Steele is one of the few genuine gentlemen left in this country. If he's offering shelter to a woman in need, it speaks to his character, not hers. But surely you must wonder. I don't waste time wondering about other people's affairs, Mrs. Winters interrupted. And neither should you. Now, about that blue silk you were interested in. Hannah leaned against the shelves, a bolt of calico clutched to her chest. She hadn't considered how her presence at Heath's ranch might affect his reputation in town. The thought that she might be causing him social difficulty distressed her deeply. That evening, as they sat at his kitchen table over a simple supper of roast chicken and potatoes, Hannah broached the subject. "I'm concerned I may be causing problems for you in town," she said carefully. "People talk, and your helping me might be misinterpreted." Heath looked up from his plate, his expression untroubled. "People will always talk. I've never much cared for their opinions. But your standing in the community is based on my work and my word, not gossip," he finished firmly. "San Angelo has known me for 7 years. If someone wants to think less of me for offering basic human kindness, that's their burden to carry, not mine." His conviction was so clear that Hannah found herself believing him. Still, a nagging worry remained. "I'll be leaving for El Paso tomorrow. I don't want to leave you dealing with rumors I caused." Heath set down his fork, his blue eyes meeting hers directly. "Hannah, please don't concern yourself with this. The kind of people whose good opinion I value Mrs. Winters, for example, or Mr. Peterson at the bookstore understand what it means to help someone in need. The rest," he shrugged. "Their opinions were never worth much to begin with." The simple dignity in his response silenced her concerns. Once again, she found herself marveling at the man fate had placed in her path, so different from the men she had known before, with their concern for appearances and social standing above all else. That night, as Hannah packed her bags for the journey to El Paso, a curious reluctance settled over her. 4 days ago, she had been desperate to continue her journey west, to reach her cousin and the promise of a new start. Now, the thought of leaving Heath's ranch and Heath himself filled her with an unexpected melancholy. She told herself it was natural to feel attachment to a place where she had found kindness and respect. But in the quiet of her borrowed room, Hannah admitted the truth was more complicated. In just 4 days, Heath Steele had become more than a generous host or temporary employer. His steady presence, his quiet strength, and his unfailing respect had awakened feelings she had thought buried beneath the pain of Henry's betrayal. "Don't be foolish," she whispered to herself as she folded a nightgown into her bag. "He offered shelter, not a future." Still, as she finally closed her luggage and prepared for bed, Hannah couldn't help wondering what might have been possible if circumstances had been different, if she had met Heath Steele before Henry, before the baby, before her life had taken its complicated turn. The final morning of Hannah's stay dawned clear and cool, with a hint of autumn in the air despite the August date. She woke early, having slept fitfully, and found Heath already in the kitchen preparing a more elaborate breakfast than usual: fresh biscuits, eggs, bacon, and even preserved peaches from his small orchard. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble," Hannah said as she entered, touched by the gesture. "Wanted to send you off properly," Heath replied, sliding a pan of golden biscuits from the oven. "The stagecoach ride to El Paso is long and the food at the stations leaves much to be desired." They ate breakfast mostly in silence, the approaching farewell hanging between them. Hannah found herself memorizing details of the kitchen: the worn wooden table, the cast iron stove, the row of coffee cups hanging from hooks, Heath's strong hands breaking open a biscuit to add butter. These small moments had become precious to her in ways she hadn't anticipated. After breakfast, Heath loaded Hannah's bags into the wagon for the ride to town. The stagecoach was scheduled to depart at 10 o'clock, leaving them just enough time to reach the station. "I've packed some food for your journey," Heath said, handing her a cloth-wrapped parcel. "Nothing fancy: biscuits, cheese, dried beef, and some of those peaches. Should hold you until the first station." The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought a lump to Hannah's throat. "Thank you." "For everything." Heath nodded, seeming to understand all the things she wasn't saying. Their ride to town was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. The main street of San Angelo was already busy with morning activity when they arrived at the stagecoach office. Heath unloaded Hannah's bags while she confirmed her ticket with the clerk. "Stage is running on time," the clerk informed her. "Should be pulling in any minute now." Outside, Heath had arranged her luggage on the sidewalk. Other passengers were gathering: a middle-aged couple, a young man in a business suit, and an older gentleman who looked to be a traveling salesman. "Well," Hannah said, facing Heath, suddenly unsure how to say goodbye to this man who had changed so much for her in so short a time. "I don't know how to thank you properly." "No thanks necessary," Heath replied, his voice gentle. "I'm glad our paths crossed." "As am I," Hannah said softly. In the distance, she could hear the approaching stagecoach, the sound of horses and wheels on the packed dirt road. "My cousin in El Paso, her name is Margaret Ellison, if you're ever that way." "I'll remember," Heath promised. He hesitated, then reached into his pocket. "I want you to have this, in case your plans in El Paso don't work out as expected." He handed her a folded piece of paper. Hannah opened it to find a bank draft for $100, a considerable sum. "Heath, I can't accept this," she protested, trying to hand it back. "You can," he insisted quietly. "And you will. Consider it an investment in your future and your child's." His blue eyes held hers. "If you don't need it, you can return it someday." The stagecoach rounded the corner then, 4 horses pulling the vehicle to a stop in front of the office. The driver called for passengers to board as the station attendant began loading luggage. "That's my cue," Hannah said, still holding the bank draft, unable to refuse his generosity in these final moments. Heath nodded, his expression carefully controlled. "Safe journey, Hannah." Impulsively, Hannah stepped forward and placed a quick, gentle kiss on his cheek. "Thank you for restoring my faith in good men," she whispered. Before she could see his reaction, she turned and allowed the attendant to help her into the stagecoach. The other passengers settled around her as the luggage was secured. Through the window, she could see Heath standing on the sidewalk, tall and steady in the morning light. As the driver called to the horses and the coach lurched forward, Hannah raised her hand in a final farewell. Heath touched the brim of his hat in response, his figure growing smaller as the stagecoach picked up speed and carried her away from San Angelo, and away from the man who had shown her that kindness could come without conditions and respect without judgment. Hannah's eyes remained fixed on Heath's diminishing figure until the stagecoach turned a corner, and he vanished from sight. Only then did she allow the tears she'd been holding back to fall, quickly wiping them away before her fellow passengers could notice. The stagecoach journey to El Paso was as uncomfortable as Heath had warned. The bench seats were hard, the road rough, and the stations where they stopped to change horses offered only the most basic amenities. Hannah was grateful for the food Heath had packed, which proved far superior to the meals available at the way stations. Her fellow travelers were polite but distant, occasionally casting curious glances at her condition, but asking few questions. The middle-aged couple, the Hendersons, were returning to their home in El Paso after visiting family in Dallas. They offered Hannah some small kindnesses, Mrs. Henderson sharing a cushion for the hard seat. Mr. Henderson helping her in and out of the coach at stops. As the miles stretched on, and the landscape changed from the rolling hills around San Angelo to the more arid terrain approaching El Paso, Hannah found her thoughts continually returning to Heath. The memory of his quiet strength, his unwavering respect, and the comfortable evening spent in conversation on his porch had taken root in her heart. "First time to El Paso?" Mrs. Henderson asked during their second day of travel, breaking a long silence. "Yes," Hannah replied. "My cousin lives there. I'm going to stay with her until after." She gestured to her belly. Mrs. Henderson nodded understandingly. "El Paso's growing fast, rough in parts, but there's opportunity there for those willing to work hard." "That's my hope," Hannah said. "I was a teacher back east. I'd like to teach again once the baby is older." "The city just opened a new school," Mr. Henderson offered. "They're always looking for educated folks to teach the children." The information sparked hope in Hannah's chest. Perhaps her plan to rebuild her life in El Paso was not as tenuous as she feared. By the time the stagecoach rolled into El Paso 3 days later, Hannah was exhausted, dust-covered, and increasingly anxious about the reception she might receive from her cousin Margaret. They had corresponded sporadically over the years, but hadn't seen each other since childhood. Margaret's offer of assistance had been a lifeline when Hannah's parents cast her out. But now, facing the reality of arriving on her distant cousin's doorstep, 7 months pregnant and unwed, Hannah's confidence wavered. El Paso was larger and busier than she had imagined. A growing city where the influences of America and Mexico blended visibly in architecture, language, and culture. The stagecoach deposited its passengers at the central station, where Hannah collected her bags and asked directions to the address she had for her cousin. "That's in Sunset Heights," the station agent told her. "Nice neighborhood, about a mile north. You'll want to hire a hack." He eyed her condition. Not a walk for a lady in your state. Hannah used some of her carefully budgeted money to hire a carriage to take her to Margaret's home. As they traveled through the bustling streets, she found herself comparing everything to San Angelo and finding El Paso larger but somehow less appealing. Perhaps it was just fatigue coloring her impression, she thought. Margaret's house proved to be a handsome 2-story home on a street lined with similar residences. Hannah paid the driver, took a deep breath, and approached the front door with trepidation. Her knock was answered by a maid who regarded her with surprise. "May I help you, madam?" "I'm here to see Mrs. Margaret Ellison," Hannah said. "I'm her cousin, Hannah Griffith." The maid's expression changed to one of confusion. "Mrs. Ellison isn't expecting visitors today." "She's expecting me, though perhaps not today specifically," Hannah explained, growing uneasy. "I wrote to her from Philadelphia several months ago. She invited me to stay with her." "One moment, please." The maid left Hannah standing on the porch, her anxiety mounting with each passing second. When the door opened again, a well-dressed woman in her 30s appeared. Her fashionable attire and carefully arranged hair spoke of wealth and social position. She studied Hannah with obvious surprise, her eyes lingering on Hannah's pregnant belly. "Hannah, is that you? Good heavens, I hardly recognized you." Margaret's voice was cool, her smile not reaching her eyes. "You're further along than I expected." 7 months now, Hannah confirmed, increasingly aware of the dust on her traveling clothes and her disheveled appearance after days on the stagecoach. "I'm sorry if I've arrived at an inconvenient time." No, Margaret said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Do come in. You must be exhausted from your journey." Hannah followed her cousin into an elegantly appointed parlor, feeling increasingly out of place among the fine furnishings and tasteful decorations. Margaret rang for tea, then seated herself across from Hannah, her posture rigid. "I must say, I was rather expecting you next month," she said. "Your letter was somewhat vague about your timeline. The situation in Philadelphia became untenable," Hannah explained carefully. "I had to leave sooner than planned." Margaret nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Yes, well, these situations are always difficult." She paused as the maid brought in tea. Once they were alone again, she continued in a lower voice. "I should tell you, Hannah, that my husband William is unaware of your circumstance. I told him only that a widowed cousin might be visiting." Hannah felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "I see. William is very concerned with our social position here," Margaret explained, pouring tea with hands that trembled slightly. "He's running for city council, you understand. Appearances are critical." "Of course," Hannah said quietly, beginning to understand where this conversation was leading. "The thing is, my dear," Margaret continued, not quite meeting Hannah's eyes, "we've been invited to spend the next 3 months at William's family estate in California. We leave the day after tomorrow. The house will be closed up while we're away, with only the gardener checking in occasionally." The implication was clear. Hannah would not be welcome to stay. "I see," Hannah said again, her heart sinking. "I apologize for the poor timing." "It's most unfortunate," Margaret agreed, seeming relieved that Hannah understood without requiring a more direct rejection. "Had you arrived next month as I expected, we might have made arrangements before our departure. As it is—" "I understand," Hannah said, struggling to keep her voice steady. Once again, family had failed her when she needed them most. "Perhaps you could recommend a respectable boarding house where I might stay until I find more permanent arrangements." Margaret brightened at this practical question. "Yes, of course. Mrs. Holbrook runs a women's boarding house on Mesa Street. Very respectable. I'm sure she would accommodate you." She hesitated, though it might be expensive for an extended stay. Hannah thought of the bank draft from Heath, still safely tucked in her reticule. She had hoped to save it for after the baby's birth, but it seemed she would need it sooner. "I have some funds," she said simply. "And I intend to find work as soon as possible." Margaret looked skeptical. "In your condition, what sort of work could you do?" "I'm a skilled seamstress," Hannah replied with more confidence than she felt. "And after the baby comes, I hope to return to teaching." Their conversation continued for another half-hour, growing increasingly strained. Margaret provided the address for Mrs. Holbrook's boarding house and offered to have her carriage take Hannah there, a gesture that seemed motivated more by a desire to conclude their meeting than genuine helpfulness. As Hannah prepared to leave, Margaret pressed a small envelope into her hand. "A little something to help with your immediate expenses," she said. "I do wish circumstances were different, cousin." In the carriage, Hannah opened the envelope to find $20, a sum that might cover a week's board at most. The pittance, offered as if it were great generosity, crystallized Hannah's understanding of her situation. She was truly alone in El Paso, with no family support to rely on after all. Mrs. Holbrook's boarding house proved to be clean and respectable, if somewhat austere. The proprietress, a widow in her 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner, looked Hannah over critically when she inquired about a room. "I don't usually take women in your condition," she said bluntly. "Causes talk among the other boarders." "I understand," Hannah replied, fighting exhaustion and disappointment. "But I can pay 2 weeks in advance, and I assure you I'll be no trouble." Mrs. Holbrook studied her for a long moment. "You have family in town?" "No," Hannah admitted. "My cousin is leaving for California." Something in Mrs. Holbrook's expression softened slightly. $3 a week gets you a room and 2 meals a day. No gentlemen callers, no noise after 9, and church attendance on Sundays is expected." "That's very fair," Hannah agreed, relieved to have secured lodging at least. "Thank you." The room she was shown to was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, a small writing desk, and a wardrobe. The window overlooked a modest garden, a pleasant surprise in the desert city. Once alone, Hannah sank onto the bed, the events of the day catching up with her. She had traveled hundreds of miles only to find her supposed safe harbor closed to her. Now she was in a strange city with limited funds and no connections, 7 months pregnant and unwed. For the first time since leaving Heath's ranch, Hannah allowed herself to weep for the life she had lost, for the uncertainties ahead, and for the brief days of warmth and acceptance she had experienced in San Angelo. In those moments of deepest despair, it was Heath's calm voice she heard in her mind. "You're stronger than you know, Hannah. This child is fortunate to have such a mother." Drawing on that memory of confidence in her, Hannah dried her tears and began to make plans. She would rest tonight, then begin looking for work tomorrow. Mrs. Holbrook might know of families needing sewing done or households requiring help. 2 weeks of secured lodging gave her time to establish herself. As twilight fell over El Paso, Hannah unpacked her few belongings and prepared for bed. Among her things, she found the book of Whitman's poetry that Mr. Peterson had given her in San Angelo. Opening it randomly, her eyes fell on a line that seemed to speak directly to her situation. "Not I, nor anyone else can travel that road for you. You must travel it by yourself." "Yes," she whispered to the darkening room. "But knowing someone believes you can make the journey makes all the difference." The following week proved challenging but not impossible. Mrs. Holbrook, while stern, turned out to have connections throughout El Paso. She introduced Hannah to several families who needed sewing work done, alterations, mending, and even a wedding dress that required elaborate beadwork. "You've got skilled hands," Mrs. Holbrook observed after seeing some of Hannah's work. "That's a blessing that will serve you well." Hannah established a small business operating from her room at the boarding house. The work wasn't as steady as she might have hoped, but it provided enough income to extend her stay beyond the initial 2 weeks. More importantly, it gave her purpose and a sense of accomplishment during days that might otherwise have been consumed by worry. As her 8th month of pregnancy progressed, Hannah's body grew increasingly uncomfortable. The summer heat of El Paso was oppressive, making her daily tasks more difficult. Several of the other boarders, mostly school teachers and shop clerks, initially kept their distance, but gradually began to offer small kindnesses. A fan when the heat was worst, peppermint tea for nausea, companionship during evening meals. "You remind me of my sister," Miss Porter, a kindergarten teacher, told her one evening as they sat in the garden after dinner. "She found herself in a similar situation 5 years ago. Now she's married to a good man who treats her son as his own." She patted Hannah's hand. Life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. Hannah thought often of Heath during these days. Sometimes she imagined writing to him, telling him of her situation in El Paso. The bank draft he had given her remained unused, a last resort she was determined to avoid tapping if possible. It represented not just financial security, but a tangible reminder that someone had believed in her enough to invest in her future. 3 weeks after her arrival in El Paso, Hannah was returning from delivering a completed alteration job when she passed the newly built schoolhouse Mr. Henderson had mentioned during their stagecoach journey. On impulse, she stopped and inquired whether they might need teachers for the coming term. The school principal, Mr. Donovan, was a harried-looking man in his 40s who seemed perpetually behind on paperwork. He looked up from his cluttered desk when Hannah was shown into his office, his initial expression of welcome faltering slightly when he registered her pregnant state. "Mrs. Griffith, is it?" he asked, recovering quickly. "How may I help you?" "I was inquiring about teaching positions," Hannah said directly. "I have 5 years of experience teaching all grades in Philadelphia with particular expertise in reading and mathematics." Mr. Donovan's eyebrows rose. "I see. And your current condition?" "I expect to be unavailable for the month of October," Hannah replied evenly. "After that, I would be able to take up a full teaching schedule." "Most unusual," Mr. Donovan muttered, more to himself than to her. Then, more clearly, "We do have a significant shortage of qualified teachers. The school board has authorized me to hire up to 3 additional instructors before the term begins in September." He studied her thoughtfully. "Do you have references?" "I do," Hannah confirmed. "From the headmaster of my previous school in Philadelphia, as well as from several parents of students." "And the father of your child. Would he object to your employment?" The question was presumptuous but not unexpected. "There is no father in the picture," Hannah said, maintaining her composure. "I will be raising the child alone." Mr. Donovan looked surprised but not scandalized. "That will be challenging, I am well aware," Hannah replied, "but not impossible. Several of the boarders where I'm staying are single women who manage careers. I'm sure arrangements can be made for childcare during school hours." Her directness seemed to impress him. "Leave your references with me," he said after a moment's consideration, "and come back next week. I'll need to discuss this with the school board, but I won't deny we're desperate for qualified teachers. Most young women who come west to teach end up married within a year." Hannah left the school with cautious optimism. It wasn't a job offer, but it was more possibility than she had dared hope for at this stage. As she walked back to the boarding house, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she taught during the day and returned to a small home of her own in the evenings, where her child would be waiting. It wasn't the life she had planned in Philadelphia, but it held its own promise of fulfillment. That evening, sitting at the small desk in her room, Hannah finally wrote to Heath. She described her arrival in El Paso, her cousin's rejection, and the small successes she had achieved since. She thanked him again for his kindness and assured him that she was managing well, still holding his generous bank draft in reserve. "Your belief in me gave me courage when I needed it most," she wrote near the end. "I think of our conversations often and find strength in the memory of those peaceful evenings on your porch." After signing the letter, Hannah held it for a long moment, rereading her words. There was nothing improper in them, yet they revealed more of her heart than she had intended. With a sigh, she folded the pages and slipped them into an envelope. Whether she would actually send, it remained undecided. The following day brought an unexpected development. Mrs. Holbrook called Hannah into her private sitting room after breakfast, her expression grave. "There's been talk in town," she said without preamble, "about your situation." Hannah's heart sank. "I've been discreet." "It's not your behavior," Mrs. Holbrook interrupted. "It's your cousin. Apparently, before leaving for California, Mrs. Ellison felt the need to explain to her circle why she couldn't accommodate her poor, unwed cousin during her unfortunate predicament. The older woman's tone made her opinion of such gossip clear. "I see," Hannah said quietly, mortification washing over her. "El Paso society can be provincial," Mrs. Holbrook continued. "Mrs. Ellison's friends include several school board members' wives." The implication was clear. Hannah's prospects for teaching position might now be in jeopardy. "What would you advise?" Hannah asked, respecting the older woman's knowledge of local dynamics. Mrs. Holbrook considered for a moment. "Continue as you have been. Your sewing work is building a reputation for quality. That counts for something, even among the gossips. She hesitated. But perhaps consider alternatives to the school. There may be less visible positions that would suit your talents. Hannah nodded, fighting disappointment. She had known rebuilding her life would not be easy, but each setback tested her resolve. That afternoon, a messenger arrived at the boarding house with a note from Mr. Donovan. The message was brief and formal. After consideration, the school board had decided to pursue other candidates for the teaching positions. Mr. Donovan expressed regret, but offered no explanation. Hannah read the rejection with a calm that surprised even her. Perhaps she had been preparing for this outcome since Mrs. Holbrook's warning. She carefully folded the note and placed it in her desk drawer, then returned to the christening gown she was embroidering for a merchant's wife. As she worked, her mind drifted to San Angelo and Heath's ranch. The memory of those few peaceful days took on an almost dream-like quality in contrast to her current struggles. Had it really been only a month since she left? It seemed like years. That evening, Hannah made a decision. She took out the letter she had written to Heath, read it once more, added a brief postscript, and addressed the envelope. Tomorrow she would post it. Whatever came of it, even if it was merely the comfort of connection with the one person who had offered her unconditional acceptance, it felt right to reach out across the distance. The next week brought more changes. 2 of Hannah's regular sewing clients canceled their orders, offering vague excuses that Hannah recognized as the effects of gossip spreading through El Paso society. But for every door that closed, another seemed to open. Mrs. Holbrook introduced her to the owner of a small dressmaking shop, who needed additional help with fine work, offering steady employment that could be done from Hannah's room during her confinement, and later in the shop when she was able. "You've got talent," the shop owner, Mrs. Leary, told her after examining her stitching. "And I don't much care for society gossip. My business is dresses, not judging who wears them or who makes them." As Hannah's pregnancy entered its final month, she found herself surprisingly at peace. Her financial situation, while not secure, was stable enough to allay immediate fears. She had a roof over her head, work that utilized her skills, and even a few developing friendships among the more open-minded boarders. Yet in quiet moments, especially in the evenings when she sat by her window watching the desert sunset paint the sky in fiery hues, Hannah found her thoughts returning to Heath. She had posted her letter 3 weeks ago, but had received no reply. Perhaps he had moved on, or perhaps he had no interest in maintaining contact with a woman whose life had briefly intersected with his. The thought brought an ache that surprised her with its intensity. On a warm September evening, as Hannah sat in the boarding house garden enjoying a rare moment of comfort as a cool breeze provided relief from the day's heat, Mrs. Holbrook appeared with an envelope. "This came for you," she said, handing over the letter. "From San Angelo." Hannah's heart leaped at the sight of Heath's neat, precise handwriting on the envelope. She waited until Mrs. Holbrook had returned inside before carefully opening it, her fingers trembling slightly. Heath's letter was longer than she had expected, written in the same thoughtful, direct manner in which he spoke. He expressed concern over her cousin's reception and approval of Hannah's resourcefulness in establishing herself despite the setback. He wrote of changes at the ranch, a new barn under construction, additional cattle purchased at auction, plans for expanding his grazing land. "San Angelo continues much as you left it," he wrote, "though Mrs. Winters asks after you regularly. She mentioned that your work is missed at her shop." Near the end of the letter, his tone became more personal. "I find myself thinking of our conversations on the porch in the evenings. The house seems quieter now. Sometimes I catch myself listening for questions about my books or observations about the sunset that don't come." The final paragraph made Hannah catch her breath. "I have business in El Paso next month, a cattle sale that promises good prices. Perhaps, if you are agreeable, I might call on you during my stay. I would value the opportunity to see how you are faring in person." Hannah pressed the letter to her heart, emotions washing over her in waves. The prospect of seeing Heath again filled her with a joy she hadn't expected, and a sudden awareness of how much his brief presence in her life had meant to her. That night, Hannah wrote a response, assuring Heath that she would welcome his visit. She provided the address of the boarding house and added, with careful honesty, that she looked forward to seeing him again. As she sealed the envelope, she acknowledged to herself what she had been avoiding for weeks. Somewhere between that first night of refuge and their parting at the stagecoach, she had developed feelings for Heath Steele that went far beyond gratitude. The realization was both frightening and exhilarating. Hannah had sworn to herself after Henry's betrayal that she would never again be vulnerable to a man's influence over her happiness. Yet here she was, her heart quickening at the thought of Heath's visit, hoping for what exactly? She couldn't say. Only that his presence in her life, however brief, had awakened something she had thought permanently extinguished. 2 days after sending her reply to Heath, Hannah woke in the early hours of the morning to a sharp pain across her lower back. By dawn, there was no mistaking what was happening. Her labor had begun, nearly 3 weeks earlier than expected. Mrs. Holbrook took charge with practiced efficiency, sending for the midwife and helping Hannah prepare for what lay ahead. The hours that followed blurred into a haze of pain, effort, and determination. Hannah found reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, focusing on each breath, each push, each moment that brought her child closer to the world. Late that afternoon, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Hannah's daughter was born small but healthy, with a shock of dark hair and lungs that announced her arrival with impressive vigor. As the midwife placed the swaddled infant in her arms, Hannah felt a love so overwhelming it brought tears to her eyes. "Hello, Grace," she whispered to the tiny red face. The name had come to her weeks ago, a reminder of what had saved her during her darkest moments. "Welcome to the world." The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion, joy, and adjustment. Grace proved to be a good baby, nursing well and sleeping for reasonable stretches. Mrs. Holbrook and several of the boarders helped where they could, allowing Hannah brief periods of rest between feedings. In quiet moments, when Grace slept peacefully in the small cradle Mrs. Holbrook had found in the attic, Hannah found herself thinking of Heath's upcoming visit. He would arrive in mid-October, according to his letter, just 3 weeks away now. The thought of introducing him to Grace filled her with a curious mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Would he see Henry in the baby's features? Would it change how he viewed them both? Hannah's recovery progressed well, and by the beginning of October, she was able to resume some of her sewing work, though at a reduced pace. Mrs. Leary proved to be understanding about the early birth, extending her deadline for the wedding dress Hannah had been working on and bringing simpler projects that could be managed while caring for a newborn. "My sister had 5 children," Mrs. Leary told her during one visit. "I know how impossible it seems at first, balancing work and motherhood, but women have been doing it since the beginning of time. You'll find your rhythm." The encouragement meant more to Hannah than she could express. Slowly, a new normal began to take shape, days structured around Grace's needs, but with spaces carved out for work and small moments of self. Hannah wrote to Heath again, sharing the news of Grace's early but healthy arrival. His reply came surprisingly quickly, offering congratulations and confirming that his business in El Paso was still planned for mid-October. "I look forward to meeting your daughter," he wrote, the simple statement causing an unexpected surge of emotion in Hannah. How different from Henry's reaction to news of the pregnancy, a reaction of panic, denial, and ultimately abandonment. On a bright October morning, 2 weeks after Grace's birth, Hannah was sitting in the boarding house parlor, the baby sleeping in her arms when Mrs. Holbrook appeared at the door. "You have a visitor," she announced, her expression curious. "A Mr. Steele from San Angelo." Hannah's heart leaped. "Heath is here, already." She glanced down at her simple day dress and wished suddenly that she had taken more care with her appearance. "Shall I show him in, Mrs. Holbrook asked. "Yes, please," Hannah replied, quickly tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear and adjusting Grace more securely in her arms. A moment later, Heath stepped into the parlor, removing his hat as he entered. He looked just as Hannah remembered, tall and steady, with those striking blue eyes that seemed to see straight through pretense to truth. He was dressed more formally than she had seen him before, in a clean white shirt, dark vest, and new-looking trousers, his boots polished to a shine. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the weeks of separation falling away. Then Heath's gaze dropped to the bundle in Hannah's arms and his expression softened. "You came early," Hannah said, finding her voice. "The cattle buyer moved up the auction," Heath explained, still standing near the door. "I should have sent word, but things moved quickly." He hesitated. "I can come back later if this isn't a good time." "No," Hannah said quickly. "No, I'm very glad to see you." She gestured to the chair opposite hers. "Please sit, meet Grace." Heath moved forward and took the offered seat, his eyes now fixed on the sleeping infant. "She's beautiful," he said quietly. "Looks like her mother." The simple compliment warmed Hannah through. "Would you like to hold her?" Heath looked momentarily startled, then nodded. Hannah carefully transferred the sleeping baby to his arms, showing him how to support her head. Grace stirred briefly, then settled against his chest, continuing her peaceful slumber. The sight of her daughter cradled so gently in Heath's strong arms stirred emotions Hannah wasn't prepared for. This man, who had shown her nothing but kindness and respect, now held the most precious thing in her world with the same careful consideration. "You're a natural," she observed, noticing how comfortably he adjusted to holding the infant. "Had some practice with my sister's children, years ago," Heath replied, his voice soft as he studied Grace's tiny features. "Before the war." They talked quietly for the next hour, catching up on the weeks since Hannah had left San Angelo. Heath told her more about his ranch improvements and his business in El Paso. He was selling 20 head of cattle and looking to purchase breeding stock with the proceeds. Hannah shared the story of Grace's early arrival and her ongoing work for Mrs. Leary's dress shop. When Grace woke hungry, Heath excused himself to allow Hannah privacy for nursing. "I'll be in town for 3 days," he said as he prepared to leave. "Perhaps if you're feeling strong enough, we might take a short walk tomorrow. The weather is supposed to be fine." "I'd like that," Hannah replied, touched by his consideration for her recent childbirth. Around 10, Grace is usually content after her morning feeding. Heath nodded, replacing his hat. "Until tomorrow, then." At the door, he paused. "It's good to see you, Hannah. You look, well, motherhood suits you." After he left, Hannah sat nursing Grace, her mind replaying every moment of Heath's visit. There had been a new tension between them, not unpleasant, but undeniable. Something had shifted in their relationship, though Hannah couldn't quite define the change. Mrs. Holbrook appeared with a knowing look. "Handsome man, you're Mr. Steele." "He's not my Mr. Steele," Hannah corrected automatically, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. "If you say so," Mrs. Holbrook replied with a small smile. "But a man doesn't travel all this way just to be polite, especially not one with a ranch to run." The observation lingered in Hannah's thoughts as she prepared for bed that evening. What was Heath's purpose in coming to see her? Was it merely the courtesy of a kind man checking on someone he had helped? Or was there something more, something that matched the feelings growing in her own heart? The next morning, Hannah took special care with her appearance, selecting her best day dress, a deep blue cotton that complemented her eyes, and arranging her hair more carefully than she had in weeks. Grace cooperated by nursing contentedly, and then falling into a peaceful sleep that allowed Hannah to place her in the small carriage Mrs. Porter, the kindergarten teacher, had lent her. Heath arrived precisely at 10, looking much as he had the previous day, though he had added a jacket despite the warm weather. His eyes lit up at the sight of Hannah, a reaction that sent a pleasant warmth through her. "You look lovely," he said simply. "Thank you," Hannah replied, unnecessarily adjusting the blanket around Grace. "Shall we go to the park? It's just a few blocks away." Their walk was pleasant, the October sun warm but not oppressive. Heath pushed Grace's carriage with careful attention, navigating the uneven sidewalks of El Paso with the same competence he brought to all tasks. They talked easily about small things, changes in San Angelo, the growth of El Paso, books they had read recently. At the park, they found a bench in the shade of a large cottonwood tree. Grace continued to sleep peacefully, allowing them a rare, uninterrupted conversation. "Mrs. Winters sends her regards," Heath said as they sat watching other park visitors stroll by. "She mentioned there might be a position at her shop if you ever return to San Angelo." The casual mention of return caught Hannah's attention. "That's kind of her," she replied carefully, "but I'm establishing myself here now." Heath nodded, his expression neutral. "Of course. You mentioned in your letter that you're working for a dress shop." "Yes, Mrs. Leary's. She's been very understanding about Grace's early arrival." Hannah smiled down at her sleeping daughter. "The work allows me to be with Grace while still earning a living." "You've done well for yourself," Heath observed. "Not many women could have managed what you have, especially alone." "I haven't been entirely alone," Hannah said softly. "Your help made all the difference in those first difficult days." Heath's expression softened. "I did very little." "You did everything," Hannah corrected. "You offered shelter when no one else would. You gave me back my dignity when others tried to take it." She hesitated, then added, "And you gave me hope that there are still good men in the world, even after what Henry did." Something shifted in Heath's eyes at the mention of Henry. "I've wanted to ask about him," he admitted. "Not out of judgment, but I find myself wondering what kind of man could walk away from you." The directness of the statement took Hannah aback. "Henry was conventional," she said after a moment's thought. "He cared very much about appearances and his position in Philadelphia society. When I told him about the baby, he saw only scandal, not the miracle of a new life." She looked down at Grace. "In some ways, his leaving was a blessing. I would rather raise her alone than with a father who resented her existence." "She deserves better," Heath agreed, his gaze also on the sleeping infant. Then, more quietly, "You both do." The simple statement hung in the air between them, laden with meaning Hannah wasn't sure how to interpret. Before she could respond, Grace woke with a small cry demanding attention. As Hannah tended to the baby, Heath watched with an expression she couldn't quite read. When Grace was settled again, content to look up at the tree branches moving in the breeze, he spoke. "Hannah, there's something I need to tell you." His tone was serious, making her heart beat faster with sudden anxiety. "What is it?" she asked, searching his face for clues. Heath took a deep breath. "My business in El Paso isn't just cattle." Or rather, the cattle business gave me an excuse for what I really came to do. He met her eyes directly. I came to see you, to ask you something important. Hannah felt her breath catch. Heath, please, let me finish before I lose my courage, he interrupted gently. In the weeks since you left San Angelo, I've thought about you constantly. About our conversations, about your strength in the face of adversity, about the way you brought light into my home during those few days. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. I know this may seem sudden or even inappropriate given your recent childbirth, but I need to speak my heart. He shifted slightly to face her more directly. Hannah, I believe we could build a good life together. You, me, and Grace. I'm offering marriage not out of pity or some misguided sense of rescue, but because I've come to care for you deeply. His blue eyes held her steadily. I think we could make each other happy. Hannah stared at him, speechless. Of all the things she had imagined Heath might say, a proposal of marriage had seemed too much to hope for. Heath, I don't know what to say. You don't need to answer now, he assured her quickly. I understand this is unexpected. I'm in El Paso for 2 more days. Take that time to consider. He glanced down at Grace. I want you to know that I would cherish your daughter as my own. No child of mine could be more loved. Tears pricked at Hannah's eyes. Why? She whispered. Why would you want us? Heath's expression was tender as he reached out to gently touch her hand. Because in those few days we spent together, I saw a future I never expected to find. Because you're the most courageous, principled woman I've ever known. Because when you left San Angelo, you took a piece of my heart with you. He smiled slightly. And because I think you might feel something for me too. Hannah couldn't deny it. In the depths of her heart, she knew she had begun falling for Heath during those quiet evenings on his porch. But fear held her back, fear of making another mistake, fear of depending on someone who might leave, fear of exposing Grace to potential rejection. I need time, she said finally. Not because I don't have feelings for you, I do, but because I have Grace to consider now. Every decision I make affects her too. Heath nodded, understanding in his eyes. Of course, I wouldn't want you to decide any other way. He stood, offering his hand to help her up. May I call on you tomorrow afternoon? Perhaps we could talk more then. I'd like that, Hannah replied, allowing him to assist her to her feet. They walked back to the boarding house in thoughtful silence, the weight of Heath's proposal creating a new awareness between them. At the door, Heath touched the brim of his hat in farewell. Until tomorrow, Hannah. After he left, Hannah went to her room and sat in the rocking chair by the window, Grace sleeping peacefully in her arms. Her mind raced with thoughts and questions. Could she trust this feeling growing between them? Was it possible to find true love so unexpectedly, after such bitter disappointment? What kind of father would Heath be to Grace? She thought of their conversations at his ranch, the respect he had shown her when the rest of San Angelo turned away, the gentle way he had held Grace. Every memory spoke of a man of integrity and kindness, qualities Henry had ultimately lacked. That evening, after putting Grace down for the night, Hannah sat at her small desk and wrote 2 letters. The first was to her parents in Philadelphia, informing them of Grace's birth and her own well-being. She had written to them once from San Angelo, receiving no reply, but felt compelled to try again. They deserved to know they had a granddaughter, whatever their feelings about the circumstances of her birth. The second letter was more difficult. Hannah wrote and rewrote the opening paragraph several times before finally finding the right words. Dear Heath, today you offered me a gift I never expected to receive again, the possibility of a shared future built on mutual respect and affection. She continued writing long into the night, expressing thoughts and feelings she had kept guarded for months. When she finally signed her name, The letter ran to 4 pages, a true accounting of her heart. The following afternoon, Hannah waited in the parlor for Heath's visit, the letter tucked into her pocket. Grace was awake but content, watching the world with the solemn curiosity of newborns. When Heath was shown in by Mrs. Holbrook, Hannah's heart quickened at the sight of him. "You look rested," he observed after greeting her and gently stroking Grace's cheek with one finger. "I feel clearer," Hannah replied, gesturing for him to sit. When Mrs. Holbrook had discreetly withdrawn, closing the parlor door behind her, Hannah continued, "I've been thinking about your proposal, Heath." And? His voice was calm, but Hannah could see tension in the set of his shoulders. In answer, she withdrew the letter from her pocket and handed it to him. "I wrote this last night. It says everything I want you to know before you hear my answer." Heath accepted the folded papers with a questioning look. "Would you like me to read it now?" Hannah nodded. "Please." As Heath read, his expression changed subtly from curiosity to deep attention, occasionally softening at particular passages. Hannah watched him, her heart in her throat, wondering if her words adequately conveyed the journey she had traveled emotionally since meeting him. When he finished the final page, Heath carefully refolded the letter and met her gaze. "Thank you for sharing this with me," he said quietly. "For trusting me with your thoughts and fears." Hannah took a deep breath. "I wrote it all down because I wanted you to understand fully who I am, what I've experienced, what I fear, what I hope for, before I give you my answer." Heath leaned forward slightly. "And that answer is—" "Yes," Hannah said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Heath Steele." As the words left her lips, a sense of rightness settled over her. "Not because I need saving, but because I believe, as you do, that we could build something beautiful together." The joy that transformed Heath's face was answer enough to any lingering doubts. He reached for her free hand, holding it gently between both of his. "You've made me very happy, Hannah." "There are practical matters we should discuss," she said, though she couldn't stop the smile spreading across her face. "Of course," Heath agreed, still holding her hand. "When and where the wedding should take place, whether you'd prefer to live at the ranch or in town. How soon you feel ready for such changes." His consideration for her wishes and needs, so different from Henry's assumptions about their future, deepened Hannah's confidence in her decision. "I think a simple ceremony soon," she suggested. "I don't want to begin our life together with Grace under a cloud of gossip." Heath nodded. "Whatever you prefer. We could marry here in El Paso before returning to San Angelo, or wait until we're back there." "San Angelo," Hannah decided. "It's where we met. Where you offered shelter when I had none. It seems fitting to begin our marriage there." She hesitated. "But I would need to give Mrs. Leary notice about the dress shop work and make arrangements for the journey with Grace." "I'll extend my stay in El Paso by a week," Heath said without hesitation. "That should give you time to settle your affairs here. We can travel back together." As they continued discussing practical arrangements, Grace began to fuss. Hannah adjusted her position, but the baby's cries grew more insistent. "She's hungry," Hannah explained. "I should feed her." "Of course," Heath said, rising. "I'll give you privacy." "Wait," Hannah said impulsively. "Heath, are you certain about this? About taking on another man's child as your own? No one would blame you for having second thoughts." Heath's expression grew serious. "Hannah, from the moment I saw you holding Grace, I've thought of her as part of the future I hope to build with you." He glanced at the fussing infant. "When I look at her, I don't see another man's child. I see your daughter, a miracle who deserves all the love and protection I can offer." His voice softened. "I already care for her because she's part of you." The simple sincerity in his words brought tears to Hannah's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Heath touched her cheek gently. "I'll come back tomorrow. We can discuss more details then. After he left, Hannah sat nursing Grace, her heart fuller than she had believed possible just days ago. The journey from Philadelphia to this moment had been arduous and unexpected, filled with loss and rejection. Yet somehow, against all odds, it had led her to a man who saw her true worth, who offered not rescue but partnership. "Your father will be Heath Steele," she murmured to Grace. "A good, honorable man who chose us both." The baby gazed up at her with solemn eyes, as if understanding the significance of the moment. That night, Hannah wrote a final letter, this one to her cousin Margaret in California. The message was brief but clear. She would be marrying Heath Steele of San Angelo and relocating there as his wife. The tone was neither triumphant nor accusatory, simply informative. Margaret's rejection had led Hannah to find her own path, a path that had ultimately led to happiness she hadn't dared imagine. The following week passed in a flurry of activity. Mrs. Leary was disappointed to lose Hannah's skilled hands, but offered genuine congratulations when she learned of the engagement. Mrs. Holbrook proved unexpectedly sentimental about Hannah's departure. "You've shown real backbone, girl," she said gruffly, as Hannah settled her final account. "And you've found a good man in Mr. Steele. I can tell by the way he looks at you and at that baby." Several of the boarders organized a small celebration on Hannah's last evening, bringing small gifts for Grace and good wishes for the journey ahead. Miss Porter, the kindergarten teacher who had been particularly kind, pressed a letter into Hannah's hand. "For the school board in San Angelo," she explained. "A recommendation when you're ready to teach again. Every child deserves an instructor who understands that life doesn't always follow the expected path." On a clear morning in late October, Hannah boarded the westbound stagecoach with Grace securely bundled in her arms and Heath beside her. As the coach pulled away from El Paso, she felt none of the uncertainty that had plagued her previous journey. Instead, a sense of homecoming filled her heart, not for Philadelphia or the life she had lost, but for the future waiting in San Angelo with the man who had offered shelter when she needed it most. The journey back to San Angelo was considerably more pleasant than Hannah's original trip. Heath's presence made all the difference, his steady hands helping her in and out of the stagecoach at stops, his attentiveness to her and Grace's needs, his ability to secure the best accommodations at way stations through a combination of courtesy and quiet insistence. Grace proved to be a remarkably good traveler for an infant, content to sleep in the gentle rocking motion of the coach and rarely fussing, except when hungry or in need of changing. Other passengers, who might have been annoyed by a baby's presence, were charmed by her good nature, and Heath's obvious devotion to a child who, as far as they knew, was his own. "You're going to be a wonderful father," Hannah observed on the second day of travel, watching Heath gently rock Grace to sleep after a feeding. "I hope so," he replied, his expression thoughtful as he studied the tiny face. "My own father was a good man but distant. Always working, rarely present even when he was home." He looked up at Hannah. "I want something different for our family." The casual way he included himself, Hannah, and Grace as our family warmed her heart. Throughout their journey, Heath had referred to Grace as our daughter when speaking to strangers, a fiction that was rapidly becoming emotional truth. They arrived in San Angelo on a crisp November afternoon, the town looking both familiar and new to Hannah's eyes. Heath drove the rented wagon directly to his ranch, explaining that he had arranged for Mrs. Winters and the pastor's wife to prepare the house for their arrival. Indeed, as they approached the modest ranch house, Hannah could see evidence of feminine attention: curtains at the windows that hadn't been there before, a small arrangement of late autumn flowers on the porch, smoke curling from the chimney suggesting a waiting meal. "Welcome home," Heath said simply as he helped her down from the wagon, Grace cradled securely in one arm. The words brought unexpected tears to Hannah's eyes. Home. After months of uncertainty and temporary shelters, the prospect of a permanent home with a man who cherished her and her child seemed almost too precious to believe. Inside, the house had been thoroughly cleaned and prepared for their arrival. A small cradle had been placed in what had been Hannah's room during her previous stay, fresh linens on the bed and a vase of flowers on the dresser. The kitchen held the aroma of freshly baked bread and a pot of stew simmering on the stove. "Mrs. Winters has been busy," Heath observed with a smile. "She was quite excited about your return." Before Hannah could respond, a knock sounded at the door. Heath opened it to reveal Mrs. Winters herself, along with an older gentleman Hannah recognized as the pastor of San Angelo's main church. "We saw you drive by, Mrs. Winters explained, stepping inside. Her eyes immediately went to Grace. "Oh, she's beautiful, may I?" Hannah carefully transferred Grace to the older woman's experienced arms, watching as Mrs. Winters cooed over the baby with genuine delight. "She has your eyes, Mrs. Winters declared, looking up at Hannah with a warm smile that held no judgment. "What a blessing!" The pastor, Reverend Thompson, greeted Heath with a handshake and Hannah with a gentle nod. "Mrs. Griffith, it's a pleasure to meet you. Heath has spoken highly of you." His kind manner put Hannah at ease immediately. There was no censure in his eyes when he glanced at Grace, only warmth and welcome. "Heath mentioned you might be willing to perform a simple wedding ceremony," Hannah said, getting directly to the point. "Indeed," the Reverend confirmed. "Whenever you feel ready. Tomorrow if that suits, or next week if you prefer more time to settle in." Heath looked to Hannah, leaving the decision to her. She thought briefly of her travel-worn state and the chaos of arrival, then of the property they all knew she and Heath were sharing. Propriety suggested one answer, practicality another. Tomorrow would be perfect, she decided. Something simple, here at the ranch if that's appropriate. "Entirely appropriate," Reverend Thompson assured her. 2 o'clock, that will give me time to bring Mrs. Thompson. She would never forgive me if she missed it. With the arrangements settled, Mrs. Winters insisted on showing Hannah the changes she had made to prepare the house for a woman and baby. The kitchen had been restocked with fresh supplies, the pantry organized, and several of Hannah's sewing projects from her previous stay completed and properly placed. The women of the church sewing circle made these, Mrs. Winters said, opening a trunk in the nursery to reveal several beautiful baby garments and blankets. "When Heath told us about Grace, we wanted to be sure she had a proper welcome." Hannah was overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. "I don't know how to thank you all. I never imagined." "No need for thanks," Mrs. Winters said briskly, though her eyes were soft. "That's what community is for. Besides, Heath Steele has helped half the town in one way or another over the years. It's time he received some goodness in return." After the visitors left, promising to return the next day for the wedding, Hannah and Heath shared a quiet meal at the kitchen table, Grace sleeping peacefully in her new cradle nearby. The domesticity of the scene, so ordinary yet so precious, filled Hannah with contentment. "Are you happy?" Heath asked, watching her face in the lamplight. "More than I thought possible," Hannah admitted. "Though I'm still adjusting to the idea that this is real, that I'm here with you, about to become your wife." She hesitated. "Part of me keeps waiting for something to go wrong, for you to change your mind, for the dream to end." Heath reached across the table to take her hand. "This is no dream, Hannah, and I'm not changing my mind." His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. "When I offered you shelter that first night, I had no thought beyond basic decency. I couldn't have imagined then that you would come to mean so much to me, or that I would find the family I never expected in you and Grace." The simple honesty of his words touched Hannah deeply. This was what had drawn her to Heath from the beginning: his straightforward integrity, his ability to speak truth without artifice or agenda. "When we met," she said softly, "I was at my lowest point, rejected by every hotel, alone and pregnant in a strange town. You offered me shelter when no one else would." She squeezed his hand. "Now you're offering me so much more: a home, a future, a father for my child. I promise to be worthy of that gift." "You already are," Heath replied, his voice low and certain. That night, Hannah slept in what had been her room during her first stay, now transformed into a proper nursery for Grace, with the cradle positioned near the bed. Heath took the main bedroom across the hall, maintaining propriety until their wedding the following day. As Hannah lay in the familiar bed, listening to Grace's soft breathing, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her back to this place. From the desperate young woman refused at every hotel to the mother and bride to be she was now, the transformation seemed almost miraculous. Yet it had happened one choice at a time, one day at a time, through her own resilience and the unexpected kindness of the man sleeping across the hall. The next day dawned clear and bright, a perfect November day for a wedding. Hannah rose early, feeding Grace and then preparing herself with careful attention. From her limited wardrobe, she selected a dove-gray dress that Mrs. Winters had altered for her during her first stay in San Angelo. Though not designed as a wedding gown, its simple elegance suited the occasion. Mrs. Winters arrived mid-morning with several other women from town, bringing flowers from late-blooming gardens, food for a small reception, and helping hands to prepare the house. Heath had been banished to the barn until the ceremony, following wedding traditions that seemed both quaint and comforting in their normalcy. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Winters declared as she helped Hannah arrange her hair, weaving small white flowers through the dark strands. Heath won't know what hit him. By 2 o'clock, everything was ready. The main room of the ranch house had been transformed with flowers and ribbons, chairs borrowed from neighbors arranged to create a small chapel-like space. Reverend and Mrs. Thompson had arrived, along with Mr. Peterson from the bookstore, and several other townspeople Hannah recognized from her brief previous stay. As Hannah stood in the hallway, Grace in her arms and her heart pounding with anticipation, Mrs. Winters approached with a small box. "Something borrowed," she said, opening it to reveal a delicate pearl necklace. "It was my mother's, then mine on my wedding day. I'd be honored if you'd wear it." Tears pricked at Hannah's eyes as Mrs. Winters fastened the pearls around her neck. This simple ceremony, arranged with such haste, was becoming more meaningful than she could have imagined, filled with the traditions and touches that she had thought lost to her when her Philadelphia wedding was canceled. The small gathering fell silent as Hannah entered the main room, Grace cradled against her shoulder. At the far end, near the stone fireplace where a welcoming fire burned, stood Heath. He had dressed in his best, a dark suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, his hair neatly trimmed, his face freshly shaven. But it was his expression as he saw her that Hannah would remember always, a look of such pure joy and wonder that it banished her last lingering doubts. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. Reverend Thompson spoke briefly about the foundations of a strong marriage: respect, kindness, patience, and unwavering commitment. Heath and Hannah exchanged traditional vows, their voices steady and sure. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Heath's kiss was gentle, but conveyed a promise of deeper passion to come. What touched Hannah most, however, was the moment immediately after, when Heath placed his hand on Grace's head and added his own personal vow. "And to you, Grace," he said softly, "I pledge my protection, my guidance, and my unconditional love. From this day forward, you are my daughter in every way that matters." The small gathering celebrated with food and conversation, the atmosphere warm and accepting. Hannah was struck by how different this was from the society wedding she had once planned in Philadelphia, smaller, simpler, but infinitely more genuine. These people had welcomed her despite knowing her circumstances, offering friendship instead of judgment. As the afternoon light began to fade, the guests gradually departed, leaving the newlyweds alone in their home. Mrs. Thompson had insisted on taking Grace for the night. "Every bride deserves an uninterrupted wedding night," she had whispered to Hannah with a motherly wink. When the house was finally quiet, Heath drew Hannah into his arms. "Mrs. Steele," he murmured against her hair. "I like the sound of that." "As do I," Hannah replied, lifting her face for his kiss. Later that night, as they lay together in what was now their shared bedroom, Hannah traced the contours of Heath's face in the moonlight streaming through the window. "You know what I thought when I first saw you?" she asked softly. "That night in San Angelo when you sent those cowboys away." Heath shook his head, his eyes warm as he gazed at her. "I thought you were too good to be true," Hannah confessed. "Men like you, kind, honorable, strong without cruelty, I had begun to think they didn't exist." Heath caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "I'm far from perfect, Hannah. But I promise to try to be worthy of that faith every day." "I know you will," she whispered. "That's who you are." As winter settled over San Angelo, Hannah and Heath established a rhythm to their new life together. The ranch demanded Heath's attention during daylight hours, while Hannah balanced caring for Grace with gradually taking over the management of the household. In the evenings, they would sit before the fire, often reading aloud to each other while Grace slept nearby. Word of their marriage had spread quickly through the town, but the reception was warmer than Hannah had dared hope. Heath's standing in the community provided a buffer against the worst of the gossip, and his obvious happiness silenced many potential critics. More importantly, those whose opinions mattered most to them, people like Mrs. Winters, Reverend Thompson, and Mr. Peterson, offered nothing but support. When Grace was baptized at the local church in December, the congregation filled the small building to capacity. Hannah was moved to tears when several women who had initially kept their distance approached after the service to admire the baby and welcome her properly to San Angelo. "Told you this town would come around," Heath said as they rode home from the church. "People just needed time to see what I saw in you from the beginning." As Christmas approached, Hannah found herself reflecting on the extraordinary year that was ending, a year that had begun with betrayal and rejection in Philadelphia, and was concluding with love and acceptance in Texas. The contrast could hardly have been greater on Christmas Eve. With the ranch house decorated with greenery and handmade ornaments, Heath presented Hannah with a small wrapped package. "It's not much," he said as she carefully opened it. "But I wanted you to have something special for our first Christmas." Inside was a silver locket, simple but elegant. When Hannah opened it, she found a tiny portrait of Heath on one side and a lock of Grace's dark hair on the other. "It's perfect," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "The two people I love most in the world, always close to my heart." Heath helped her fasten the locket around her neck, then held her close. "I have another gift," he murmured, "though it's not something I could wrap." Hannah looked up questioningly. "I received a letter from the school board yesterday," Heath explained. "They're looking for a teacher for the spring term. Someone mentioned your experience in Philadelphia and they've asked if you might be interested." The news took Hannah's breath away. "But, Grace," Mrs. Winters has already offered to watch her during school hours, Heath said with a smile. She says at 70, she's too old to run that shop all day anyway and would welcome the company of a baby. The thoughtfulness of the arrangement, Heath's understanding of her desire to teach again, Mrs. Winters' generosity, the community's willingness to give her a chance overwhelmed Hannah with gratitude. "You think I should accept?" she asked, though her heart already knew the answer. "I think you should do whatever makes you happy," Heath replied simply. "You're a born teacher, Hannah. Those children would be fortunate to have you." That night, as they lay in bed with the silver locket resting against Hannah's heart, she thought of the journey that had brought her to this moment of contentment. From the desperate young woman refused at every hotel to the wife, mother, and soon-to-be teacher, she had become the transformation seemed nothing short of miraculous. "Penny for your thoughts," Heath murmured, drawing her closer. "I was thinking about that night we met," Hannah replied. "How differently things might have turned out if you hadn't been there, if you hadn't said those simple words. You can stay with me." "Fate has its ways," Heath said, echoing words he had spoken months ago. "Sometimes the darkest moments lead us exactly where we need to be." As the fire burned low and snow began to fall gently outside their window, Hannah reflected that he was right. Every step of her difficult journey, even the painful rejections and betrayals, had led her here. To this man, this home, this life filled with purpose and love. Grace stirred in her cradle nearby, making the small, contented sounds of a dreaming infant. Tomorrow would bring Christmas Day, their first as a family. The new year would bring fresh challenges and joys: Hannah's return to teaching, Grace's continued growth, the daily work of the ranch. But whatever came, they would face it together. "Merry Christmas, my love," Heath whispered as sleep began to claim them both. "Merry Christmas," Hannah replied, knowing that of all the gifts she had received, the greatest was this: a man who had offered shelter when she needed it most, and in doing so had given her not just a home, but a heart to call her own.